Greetings and salutations. Welcome to Fireside Tales with Wolfgang, episode 39. This is, I'm flattered to say, and just now have read, Olive and Ray's favorite show. Right. We have sound, we have audio, we have a cat, we have warm tea, we have good friends and a lively audience. What else do we need? You know what we need? We need a good story. So, this evening's Fireside Tales offering, brought to you by the great outdoors. Scott Gilbert. How many of you all out there have heard of Bret Hart? And no, to clarify, I don't mean the wrestler of 1980s fame. That may just exclude a lot of the audience here. I had never heard of Bret Hart until, I think, January or so of this last year, when we did a Fireside Tales following some of his stuff. The weather's pretty good here, Anna. It's probably in the low 60s, but it's kind of hard for me to say because I've got this huge fire pit right behind me and a warm cat. Nope on a rope. Yeah. Corey Benjamin used to live just below Bret Hart Road? Seriously? Where is that? I mean, there is a Bret Hart Road. I same guy. I didn't know that. Nick Davila, it was great meeting you too, man. Absolutely, indeed. All right, what do you need before we get started, my beast? Do you need some water? Looks like he looks a little thirsty. No, just repositioning. Gotta get the beast situated before the show can actually go on. Of course. We're in a slightly unusual place, but there you go, getting all settled in, aren't you, buddy? Yeah. Want some water while we're at it? No. Okay. Thank you, Emily Thatcher. Likewise. Yeah, good. That's lovely. So here's a little bit about Bret Hart, apart from his reincarnated wrestling fame. This guy was born in the early-ish 1800s, 1836 to be a little more specific. Bret Hart is best remembered for short fiction stories, sometimes featuring miners, sometimes gamblers, but other romantic figures of the California Gold Rush. That's usually the strong suit setting of his stuff. In a career over 4 decades, he wrote poetry, plays, lectures, book reviews, editorials. He authored some magazine sketches. As he moved from California to the eastern United States and then to Europe, he incorporated new subjects and characters into his stories, but his Gold Rush tales, those are the ones that have been most often reprinted, adapted, and admired. And I don't know if Miss Corey Benjamin did reply. I'm really curious where Bret Hart Road is. It's probably Northern or Central California. That would make sense. So the guy was born in Albany, New York in 1836. He moved to California in 1854, working in a number of capacities like being a miner, being a school teacher, a messenger. He was also a journalist. He spent part of his life in Northern California in a settlement on the Humboldt Bay, which was a provisioning center for mining camps. And Humboldt is near and dear to my heart because those are where so many of my band, Hunter and the Dirty Jacks, early tours took us to, as up to Northern California, Humboldt. We're playing in Humboldt actually August 20th. It's our first public gig on the books. Okay, Corey Benjamin said it's in San Rafael, which San Rafael, California, I had to say wrong 300 times as San Rafael. You insert your favorite Renaissance painter or Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle here for justification of my mispronunciation. But yes, we have played in San Rafael many times. I think there's a Bret Hart up in the Santa Cruz Mountains too, near where I grew up, says Christy Davila. Is that a Bret Hart Road or an actual dude named Bret Hart? No, Amanda, you did not miss the beginning of the story. We are vamping with a little historical background on the author, Bret Hart. Great show tonight, Miss Amanda, by the way. Loved the duets. Of course, our duet was my favorite. But man, I love your Kermit the Frog duet. That is just, could hear that a dozen more times. It's just adorable. So, okay, a little bit more background on this author before we start. We got one story for the entire night, so I really want you to get a good idea of who this guy was. Bret Hart was unsuccessful at making a living in the gold camps, as so many people were. There were a lot of people that tried. That tried their hand at the gold rush the exact same way that they moved to Los Angeles and try their hand at acting or whatever else people move to LA to do these days. Some people just move to Los Angeles for all the table waiting opportunities, and Bret Hart, I think, did something like that with the gold camps. But when that didn't work out, he signed on as a messenger with Wells Fargo. Christina pointed out to me earlier today that Wells Fargo has a logo to this very day that's apparently a stagecoach, and it says something like founded in some previous century. I don't bank with Wells Fargo. I was not privy to that information. After spending a few months, I love this phrase, after spending a few months guarding treasure boxes on stagecoaches, he gave it up to become a schoolmaster near the town of Sonora. He created a really famous character, Yuba Bill, from his memory of an old stagecoach driver. In the year 1860, something crazy happened, and it wasn't just the beginning of the first shots of the Civil War. It was that between 80 and 200 Wiyut Indians were massacred in Humboldt County. So the thing that changed Bret Hart's life as an author and shifted around his career is that Hart published an editorial which condemned the attack and described a very detailed account of the bodies of the bloody slayings of women and children. A quote from this is, "A more shocking and revolting spectacle never was exhibited to the eyes of a Christian and civilized people." unquote. I love how a Christian and civilized people is still like a worthwhile adjective for him, as opposed to the poor godless sodomites of other religions he didn't believe in. After Hart, however, published the editorial, his life was threatened, and he was forced to move. Probably much like Salman Rushdie after he published the Satanic Verses that got all his life jumbled by religious extremists. So he quit his job and he moved to San Francisco. In 1863, the Atlantic Monthly published Hart's first short story. And in 1868, Hart became the editor of the Overland Monthly. His short story, The Luck of the Roaring Camp, perhaps his most famous, appeared in the magazine's second issue, and that made him nationally famous. The same periodical published his story, The Outcasts of Poker Flat, in January of 1869, and was remembered to the world when also in January it was read on Fireside Tales with Wolfgang. In 1878, Bret Hart was appointed as United States consul in Krefeld, Germany, and then he went to Glasgow in 1880. He spent 30 years in Europe, moving to London in 1885, but he died in England of throat cancer in 1902. So, with that and a 1-ounce shot of tequila, we couldn't find a publishing date on this story, but it clearly had to have been after 1878. The story is called The Indiscretion of Elsbeth by Bret Hart. The American paused. He had evidently lost his way. For the last half hour, he had been wandering in a medieval town in a profound medieval dream. Only a few days had elapsed since he had left the steamship. As he walked through this old-world town, it almost seemed to him that he was falling asleep in the past. He marveled to think that this place had once held his ancestors. His love for historic truth eventually led him also to regard an honest farmer standing beside his cattle in the quaint marketplace. He also noticed a kind-faced, black-eyed servant girl in a doorway as a possible type of his progenitors. He had passed the long rows of quaint houses until he knew that he had wandered far from his hotel. He did not care, however, to retrace his steps and return by the way he had come. There was, he reasoned, some other street or turning that would eventually bring him to the marketplace and his hotel. He turned at right angles into a narrow grass lane, which was as neatly kept as, apparently, as public as the highway. A few minutes walking convinced him that it was not a thoroughfare, and that it led to the open gates of a park. This had something of a public look, which suggested that his intrusion might at least be a pardonable trespass, and he decided to rely on the exonerating quality of a stranger's ignorance. The park lay in the direction he wished to go, and yet it struck him as singular that a park of such extent should be still allowed to occupy such valuable urban space. He diverged toward the only boundary, which was a high, thick-set hedge to the right, whose line he had been following. As he neared it, He heard the sound of voices on the other side speaking in German, with which he was rather unfamiliar. Having as yet met no one, and being now impressed with the fact that, for a public space, the park was singularly deserted, he determined to take this only chance of inquiring his way. The hedge was thinner in some places than in others, and at times he could see not only the light through it, but even the moving figures of the speakers, and the occasional white flash of a summer gown. At last, he determined to penetrate the hedge, and with little difficulty he emerged on the other side, but here he paused motionless. He found himself behind a somewhat formal and symmetrical group of figures with their backs toward him, but all stiffened into attitudes as motionless as his own, and all gazing with a monotonous intensity in the direction of a handsome building. The building had been invisible above the hedge, but now seemed to arise suddenly before him. Some of the figures were in uniform immediately before him, but so slightly separated from the others that he was able to see the house between her and her companions. He was confronted by the pretty back, shoulders, and blonde hair of a young girl of approximately 20. Convinced that he had unwittingly intruded upon some important ceremony, he instantly slipped back into the hedge. He was so silent that his momentary presence was evidently undetected. When he regained the parkside, he glanced back through the hedges. There was no movement of the figures, nor break in the silence to indicate that his intrusion had been observed. With a long breath of relief, he hurried from the park. It was late when he finally got back to his hotel. His first inquiry of the porter in the courtyard was in regard to the park. The porter replied that there was no public park in all of Altstadt. The air possibly alluded to Hof Gardens, the Schloss, which was in the direction that he had just indicated. The Schloss was the residency of the hereditary Grand Duke. Indeed, the Duke was presently stopping there with several of the nobility. There was naturally a party there, a family reunion to the plebs among us. But, of course, it was a private enclosure. At times, when the Grand Duke was not in residence, those times it was open to the public. At such times, tickets of admission were to be had at the hotel for 50 Pfennig. Pfennig, of course, is the local currency of the time. There was not much to see except a model farm and dairy, clearly the pretty toy of a previous Grand Duchess. But the American seemed destined to come into closer collision with the modern life of Altstadt. On entering the hotel, wearied by his long walk, he passed the landlord and a man in a half-military uniform on the landing near his room. As he entered his apartment, he had a vague impression, without exactly knowing why, that the landlord and the military stranger had just left it. This feeling was deepened by the evident disarrangement of certain articles in his unlocked suitcase and a disorganization of his personal writing case. They'd gone through his stuff. A wave of indignation passed over him. It was followed by a knock at the door, and the landlord blandly appeared with the man in uniform. A thousand pardons, said the former smilingly, but Herr Sanderman, the inspector of police, wishes to speak with you. I hope we are not intruding. Not now, you aren't, said the American dryly. The two exchanged a vacant and deprecating smile. I have only to ask a few formal questions, said the inspector in excellent but somewhat over-precise English, to supplement the report by which, as a stranger, you may not know is required by the police from the landlord in regard to the names and quality of his guests who are foreign to the town. You have a passport? I have, said the American, still more dryly, but I do not keep it in my unlocked suitcase, nor in an open writing case. An admirable precaution, said Sanderman, with unmoved politeness. May I see it? Thank you, he added, glancing over the document which the American produced from his pocket. I see that you are a born American citizen, and an earlier knowledge of that fact would have prevented this little contretemps. You are aware, Mr. Hoffman, that your name is German? Yes. My ancestors came from this country 2 centuries ago, said Hoffman, curtly. We are indeed honored by your return to it, returned Sanderman suavely. But it was the circumstance of your name being a local one and the possibility of your still being a German citizen and therefore liable to military duty, which has caused the trouble. His manner was clearly civil and courteous, but Hoffman felt that all the time his own face and features were undergoing a profound scrutiny from the speaker. And at the moment, you're making sure that you will know me again? Said Hoffman, with a smile. Indeed, returned Sanderman with a bow. Although you will permit me to say that your description here, pointing to the passport, scarcely does you justice. Hoffman, though not conceited, had not lived 20 years without knowing that he was, objectively speaking, very good-looking. Yet, there was something in the remark that caused him to color with a new uneasiness. The inspector rose with another bow and moved toward the door. I hope you will let me make amends for this intrusion by doing anything I can do to render your visit here a pleasant one. Perhaps, he added, it is not for long. But Hoffman evaded the evident question as he resented what he imagined was a possible sneer. I have not yet determined the length of my stay, he said. The inspector brought his heels together in a somewhat stiffer military salute and departed. Nothing, however, could have exceeded the almost servile courteousness of the landlord, who seemed to have been proud of this official visit to his guest. The next morning, the porter met him with a mysterious air. The heir would still like to see the Schloss. However, Hoffman, who had quite forgotten his adventure in the park, looked vacant. Indeed, the authorities had no doubt heard of his visit and had intimated to the hotel proprietor that he might have permission to visit the model farm and dairy. As the American still looked indifferent, the porter pointed out with some importance that it was a courtesy of the Duke which should not be treated lightly. Indeed, few of the townspeople themselves had ever been admitted to this eccentric grounds and display of the late Grand Duchess. The porter further pointed out that Mr. Hoffman should, of course, be silent about this invitation to visit. The court would not like it known that they had made an exception to their rules in favor of a foreigner. The American would enter quickly and boldly. There would be a housekeeper or a dairymaid or some such plebeian such as yourself and me to show him over the place. Hoffman was amused at this mysterious invitation and was inclined to classify it as a free pass to a somewhat heavy sideshow. He gravely accepted the permission and the next morning after breakfast set out to visit the model farm and dairy. Dismissing his driver, as he had been instructed to, Hoffman entered the gateway with a mingling of expectancy and a certain amusement over the boldness which the porter had suggested should characterize his entrance. Before him was a beautifully kept lane bordered by an arbor and trellised roses. He was instinctively following it when he became aware that he was mysteriously accompanied by a man in the livery of a soldier who was walking among the trees, almost abreast of him, keeping pace with his step. And after the first introductory military salute, he preserved a ceremonious silence. There was something so ludicrous in this solemn procession toward a peaceful rural place that by the time they had reached the bottom of the lane, the American had quite recovered his good humor, but here a new astonishment awaited him. Nestling before him in a green amphitheater lay a little wooden farmyard and outbuildings, which irresistibly suggested that it had been recently unpacked and set up from a box of toys. The oddly perfectly symmetrical trees, clearly copies of each other. The houses plural, with extraordinary glazed windows. Even the spotty, disproportionately sized cows in the white-fenced barnyards were all unreal. They were wooden and toy-like. Crossing a miniature bridge over a little stream, from which he was quite prepared to hook metallic fish with a magnet their own size, he looked about him for some real being to dispel the illusion. The mysterious soldier had disappeared. But under this, the arch of an arbor, which seemed to be composed of silk ribbons, green glass, and pink tissue paper, stood a quaint but delightful little figure. At first, it seemed as if he had only dispelled one illusion for another, for the figure before him might have been made of Dresden china, German porcelain, so daintily delicate and unique. Here was a young girl dressed in some forgotten medieval peasant garb of velvet braids, lace sleeves, and helmeted metallic comb. And after the Dresden method, the pale yellow of her hair was repeated in her bodice. The pink of her cheeks was in the roses of her chintz overskirt. The blue of her eyes was the blue of her petticoat. The dazzling whiteness of her neck shone again in the sleeves and stockings. Nevertheless, she was real and human, for the pink deepened in her cheeks as Hoffman's hat flew from his head, and she recognized the civility with a grave little curtsy. "You have come to see the dairy?" she said in a quaintly accurate English. "I will show you the way." "If you please," said Hoffman happily, But what?" she said, facing him suddenly with absolutely astonished eyes. Hoffman looked into them for so long that the frank wonder presently contracted into an ominous mingling of restraint and resentment. Nothing daunted, however, he went on, "Couldn't we shake all of that?" The look of wonder returned. "Shake all that?" she repeated. "I do not understand." "Well, I'm not positively aching to see cows, and you must be sick of showing them. I think, too, I've about sized the whole show. Wouldn't it be better if we just sat down in that arbor over there, supposing it won't fall down, and you just told me all about this? It would save you a heap of trouble and keep your pretty frock cleaner than traipsing around," he said with a quick transition to the gentlest courtesy. "Of course, if you're conscientious about this thing, we'll just go on and not spare a single cow. Just consider me in it with you for the whole morning." She looked at him again, and then suddenly broke into a charming laugh. It revealed a set of strong white teeth as well as a certain barbaric trace in its cadence which civilized restraint had not entirely overlaid. "I suppose she really is a peasant in spite of that pretty frock," he said to himself, as he laughed too. But her face presently took a shade of reserve, and with a gentle but singular significance, she said, "I think you must see the dairy." Hoffman's hat was in his hand with a vivacity that tumbled the brown curls on his forehead. "By all means," he said instantly, and began walking by her side in modest but easy silence. Now that he thought her a conscientious peasant, he was quiet and respectful. Presently, she lifted her eyes, which, despite her gravity, had not entirely lost their previous mirthfulness, and said, "But you, Americans, in your rich and prosperous country with your large hands and your great harvests, you must know all about farming." "Never was in a dairy in my entire life," said Hoffman gravely. "I'm from the city of New York, where the cows give swill milk and are kept in cellars." Her eyebrows contracted prettily in an effort to understand. Then she apparently gave it up and said, with a slanting glint of mischief in her eyes, "Then you come here like the other Americans in hope to see the Grand Duke and Duchess and the princesses?" No. To tell you the truth, the fact is, I almost tumbled into a lot of them. They were standing like wax figures the other side of the park lodge the other day. I got away as soon as I could. Honestly, I think I prefer the cows. Her head was slightly turned away. He had to content himself with looking upon the strong feet and their serviceable but smartly buckled shoes that uplifted her upright figure as she moved beside him. "Of course," he added with the boyish but unmistakable courtesy, "if it's part of your show to trot out the family, well, I'm into that too. I dare say you could make them interesting." "But why," she said with her head still slightly turned away toward a figure, a sturdy-looking real woman, which for the first time Hoffman perceived was walking in a line with them as the soldier had done. Why did you come here at all?" The first time was a fool accident. I was making a shortcut through what I thought was a public park. The second time was because I had been rude to a police inspector whom I found going through my things in my hotel room. He was actually searching my unlocked suitcase. But later he apologized, as I suppose, by getting me an invitation from the Grand Duke to come here, and I thought it only the square, polite thing to both of them to accept it. But frankly, I'm mighty glad I came. I wouldn't have missed you for $1,000. You see, I haven't come across anyone I cared to talk to since I arrived here. Here, he suddenly realized that she hadn't looked at him, and that the delicate whiteness of her neck was quite suffused with pink. And he stopped instantly. Presently, he said quite easily, "Who's the chorus?" "Oh, the lady?" Yeah, she's watching us as if she didn't quite approve, just as if she didn't catch on. She is the head housekeeper of the farm. Perhaps you would prefer to have her show you the dairy. Shall I call for her?" The figure in question was very short and stout, with voluminous petticoats. "Please don't. I'll stay without your setting that guardian on me. But here's the dairy. Don't let her come inside among those pans of fresh milk with that smile that she's got over there, or there might be trouble for the milk." The young girl paused too, made a slight gesture with her hand, and the figure passed on as they entered the dairy. The dairy was beautifully clean and fresh, with a persistence that he quickly recognized as mischievous and ironical, and with his character adaptability, he was as attentive as she showed him all the details as he possibly could have been. From thence, they passed to the farmyard, where he hung with breathless attention over the names of the cows and made her repeat them. Although she was evidently familiar with the subject, he could see that her zeal was fitful and impatient. "Suppose we just sit down," he said, pointing to an ostentatious rustic seat in the center of the green. "Sit down," she repeated wonderingly. "What for?" "Well, to talk. We'll just knock off and call it a half day." "But if you are not looking at the farm, you are, of course, going away," she said quickly. "Am I? I don't think these particulars were in my invitation." She broke again into a fit of laughter, and at the same time cast a bright eye around the field. "Come," he said gently. "There are no other sightseers waiting, and you're conscious. It's clear." And he moved toward the rustic seat. "Certainly not. There, she added in a low voice. They moved on slowly together to a copse of willows, which overhung the miniature stream. You are not staying in Allstadt, she said. No. I only came to see the old town that my ancestors came from. They were walking so close together that her skirt brushed his trousers. But she suddenly drew away from him and, looking him fixedly in the eye, said, "Ah, you have relatives here." Yes, he replied, but they are dead 200 years. She laughed again with a slight expression of relief. They had entered the copse and were walking in dense shadow when she suddenly stopped and sat down upon a rustic bench. To his surprise, he found that they were quite alone. So, tell me about these relatives, she said, slightly drawing aside her skirt to make room for him on the seat. He did not require a second invitation. He not only told her all about his ancestral progenitors, but even about those more recent and more nearly related to him, about his own life, his vocation. He was a clever newspaper correspondent with a roving commission. His ambitions, his beliefs. He told him about his romance. And then, perhaps of this visit, you will also make a copy? He smiled at her quick adaptation of his professional slang and jargon, but shook his head. No, he said gravely, no. This is you. The Chicago interviewer is big pay, they're rich, but it doesn't have enough capital. It doesn't have enough money to buy you from me. He gently slid his hand toward hers and slipped his fingers softly around it. She made a slight movement of withdrawal, but even then, as if in forgetfulness or indifference, permitted her hand to rest unresponsively in his. It was scarcely an encouragement to gallantry. Neither was it a rejection of an unconscious familiarity. But you haven't told me about yourself, he said. Oh, she returned with her first approach to coquetry in a laugh and a sidelong glance. Of what importance is that to you? It is the Grand Duchess and her Highness, the Princess, that you Americans seek to know. I am what I am, as you see. You bet, said Hoffman with charming decision. I what? You are. You know, you are. And that's good enough for me. But I don't even know your name. She laughed again, and after a pause, said, Elspeth. But I couldn't call you just by your first name on our first meeting, you know. Then you Americans are really so formal, eh? She said slyly, looking at her imprisoned hand. Well, yes, returned Hoffman, disengaging it. I suppose we are respectful, or mean to be. But who do I inquire for? Who may I write to? You are neither to write nor inquire. What? She had moved in her seat so as to half face him with eyes in which curiosity, mischief, and a certain seriousness alternated, but for the first time seemed conscious of his hand, and accented her words with slight pressure. You are to return to your hotel presently and say to your landlord, pack up my luggage. I have finished with this old town and my ancestors and the Grand Duke, who I do not care to see, and I shall leave Alstadt tomorrow. Thank you. I don't catch on. Of what necessity should you? I have said it. That should be enough for a chivalrous American like you. She again and significantly looked down at her hand. If you mean that you know the extent of the favor you ask of me, I can say no more, he said seriously. But I beg you, give me some reason of it. Ah, so, she said with a slight shrug of her shoulders. Then I must tell you. You say you do not know the Grand Duke and Duchess. Well, they know you. The day before yesterday, you were wandering in the park, as you admit. You say also you got through the hedge and interrupted some ceremony. That ceremony was not a court function, Mr. Hoffman, but something equally sacred. The photographing of the ducal family before the castle. You say that you instantly withdrew, but after the photograph was taken, the plate revealed a stranger standing actually by the side of the Princess Alexandrian, and even taking the place of the Grand Duke himself. That stranger, unequivocally, was you. And the picture was spoiled, said the American with a quiet laugh. I should not say that, returned the lady with a demure glance at her companion's handsome face. And I do not believe that the princess who first saw the photograph thought so either. But she is very young and willful and has the reputation of being very indiscreet. And unfortunately, she has begged the photographer not to destroy the plate, but to give it to her and say nothing about it, except that the plate was defective and to take another. Still, it would have ended there if her curiosity had not led her confide a description of the stranger to the police inspector, with the results that you know. Wait. So I'm expected to leave town because I accidentally stumbled into a family group that was being photographed. Because a certain princess was indiscreet enough to show her curiosity about you, corrected the fair stranger. But look here, I'll apologize to the princess. I'll offer to pay for the plate, even. Then you do want to see the princess, said the young girl, smiling. You are like the others. Bother the princess. I want to see you. I don't see how they can prevent it if I choose to remain, for that fact. Very easily. You will find that there is something wrong with your passport. You will be sent on to pumpernickel, perhaps for examination. You will unwittingly transgress some of the laws of the town and be ordered to leave it. You will be shadowed by the police until you will quarrel with them like a free American. And at that point, you are conducted to the frontier. Perhaps you will strike an officer who has insulted you, and then you are finished on the spot. The American's crest rose palpably until it cocked his straw hat over his curls. Suppose I'm content to risk it. I mean, let's just suppose that I first laid the whole matter in its trivial, petty cause before the American minister so that he could make it hot for this whole caboodle of a country if they happened to down me. By Jove, I shouldn't mind being the martyr of an international episode if they'd spare me long enough to get the first copy over to the other side. His eyes sparkled with a recognition of mass information spread by newspapers. You could expose them, but they would then deny the whole story, and you have no evidence. They would demand to know your informants, and I should be disgraced. And the princess, who is already talked about, made a subject of scandal. But no matter. It is right that an American's independence shall not be interfered with. She raised the hem of her handkerchief to her blue eyes and slightly turned her head aside. Hoffman gently drew the handkerchief away, and in so doing possessed himself of her other hand. Look here, Miss Elsbeth? You know I wouldn't give you away, whatever else happened. But couldn't I get hold of that photographer? I saw him. He wanted me to sit for him and make him tell me. He wanted you to sit to him, she said hurriedly. And did you? No, he replied. He was a little too fresh, though I thought he fancied some resemblance in me to, I don't know, someone else. Ah, she said, and then mumbled something to herself in German, which he did not understand. Then she added out loud, "You did well. He is a bad man, this photographer. Promise me you shall not sit for him." "How can I if I'm fired out of the place like this?" he added ruefully. "But I'd like to make him give himself away to me somehow. He will not. And if he did, he would deny it afterward. Do not go near him. Do not see him. Be careful that he does not photography you with his instantaneous instrument when you are passing. Now, you must go, and I must see the princess." "Well, let me go too. Let me accompany you. I'll explain it to her," said Kaufman. She stopped, looked at him keenly, and attempted to withdraw her hands. "Ah, then it is so. It is the princess you wish to see. You are curious. You, too. You wish to see this lady who is interested in you. I ought to have known it. You are all alike." He met her gaze with laughing frankness, accepted her outburst as a charming feminine weakness, half jealousy, half coquetry, but retained her hands. "Nonsense," he said. I wish to see her that I may have the right to see you. That you shall not lose your place here through me, that I may return again. You must never come here again. Then you must come wherever I am. We'll meet somewhere else when you have an afternoon off. You'll show me the town, the houses of my ancestors, their tombs, possibly, if the Grand Duke rampages, the probable site of my own grave. She looked into his laughing eyes with her clear, steadfast, gravely questioning blue ones. Do not hear you Americans know that it is not the fashion here in Germany for the young man and the young women to walk together unless they are verlobt. Ver which? Engaged. She nodded her head decidedly, mischievously. Well, so much the better. Ach, gut. She made a gesture of hopelessness at his incorrigibility and again attempted to withdraw her hands. I must go now. Well, then, goodbye. It was easy to draw her closer by simply lowering her still captive hands. Then he suddenly kissed her coldly startled lips and instantly released her. She, as instantly, vanished. Elsbeth, he called quickly. Elsbeth! Her now really frightened face reappeared with a heightened color from the dense foliage, quite to his astonishment. Hush, she said, with her finger on her lips. Are you mad? I only wanted to remind you to square me with the princess, he laughed as her head disappeared. He strolled back toward the gate. Scarcely had he quitted the shrubbery before the same soldier made his appearance with precisely the same salute and, keeping exactly the same distance, accompanied him to the gate. At the corner of the street, he hailed a droshky and was driven to his hotel. The landlord came up smiling. He trusted that the heir had greatly enjoyed himself at the Schloss. It was a distinguished honor, in fact, quite unprecedented. Hoffman, while he determined not to commit himself, nor his late fair companion, was nevertheless anxious to learn something more of her relations to the Schloss. So pretty, so characteristic and marked a figure must be well known to the local sightseers. Indeed, once or twice the idea had crossed his mind with a slightly jealous twinge that left him more conscious of the impression she had made on him that he had deemed possible. He asked if the model farm and dairy were always shown by the same attendants. Oh, God, no doubt, yes. His Royal Highness had quite a retinue when he was in residence. And were these attendants in costume? There was undoubtedly a livery for the servants. Hoffman felt a slight irritation at the landlord. He knew not why. But this costume was rather a historical one. Surely it was not entrusted to everyday menials, and he briefly described it. His host's blank curiosity suddenly changed to a look of mysterious and arch intelligence. Oh, God, yes! He remembered now, with his finger on his nose, that when there was a feast at the Schloss, the farm and dairy were filled by shepherdesses in quaint costume worn by the ladies of the Grand Duke's own theatrical company, who assumed the characters with great vivacity. It's kind of like the 1800s German version of a Ren Fair. Surely it was the same, and the Grand Duke had treated this man to this special courtesy. Yes, there was one pretty blonde young lady, the Fräulein Wittenbüttel, a most popular coy maiden, who would play it to the hilt. And the description fitted her all the way down to the blonde hair. There was no doubt, absolutely no doubt of it. Many persons, indeed, had been so deceived. But happily, the American could corroborate himself by going to the theater tonight. It would be a great joke, quite colossal, if he took a front seat where she could see him, and the good man rubbed his hands in gleeful anticipation. Hoffman's gradual conviction was that he himself had been ridiculously deceived. The mystery of his fair companion's costume, her undeniable wish to terminate the whole episode with that single interview, her mingling of worldly aplomb and rustic innocence, her perfect self-control and attitude of simplicity, all now struck him as perfectly comprehensible. He recalled what must have been the actress's picturesque, realistic details in the dairy. He recognized the description as he recalled their bowered confidences. How like a pretty ballet scene their whole interview on the rustic bench was, and the deception breathed through their entire conversation to their theatrical parting all the way down to the close. And the whole story of the photograph was, no doubt, as pure a dramatic invention as all the rest. Then the humor of the whole situation predominated, and he laughed until the tears came to his eyes. And with this humanizing influence upon him, he went to the theater. The theater was capacious even for that town, and although the performance was a special one, he had no difficulty in getting a whole box to himself. He had made up his mind that when his fair deceiver appeared, he would let her see by his significant applause that he recognized her, but bore no malice for the trick she had played on him. After all, he had kissed her, and he had no right to complain. Her vocation was certainly a more independent and original one than he had originally supposed, for its social quality and inequality, for all those little trivial matters, he cared nothing. He found himself longing for a glance of her calm blue eyes, for the pleasant smile that broke the seriousness of her sweetly restrained lips. There was no doubt that he should know her even as the heroine of Der Czar under the Zimmermann on the bill before him. He was becoming impatient, and the performance evidently was waiting. A stir in the outer gallery, the clatter of sabers, the filling of uniforms and filing into the royal boxes, and a triumphant burst from the orchestra showed the cause as a few ladies and gentlemen in full evening dress emerged from the background of uniforms and took their places in the front of the box. Hoffman looked with some interest for the romantic princess. Suddenly, he saw a face and shoulders in a glitter of diamonds that startled him. And then a glance that transfixed him. He leaned over to his neighbor. Psst. Psst. Who's that young lady in the box? Boop. The Princess Alexandrine. I mean the young lady in blue with blonde hair and blue eyes. It is the Princess Alexandrine Elizabeth Marie Stephanie, the daughter of the Grand Duke. There is no other there. Psst. Thank you. And boop again. He sat silently, looking at the rising curtain and at the stage. Then he rose quietly, gathered his hat and coat, and left his private viewing box. When he reached the gallery, he turned instinctively and looked back at the royal box. Her eyes had followed him. And as he remained a moment motionless in the doorway, her lips parted in a grateful smile, and she waved her fan with a faint but unmistakable gesture of farewell. The next morning, he left Altstadt. There was some little delay at the customs on the frontier, and when Hoffman received back his trunk, it was accompanied by a little sealed packet, which was handed to him by the custom house inspector. Hoffman did not open it until he was alone. There hangs upon the wall of his modest apartment in New York a narrow, irregular photograph, ingeniously framed, of himself standing side by side with a young German girl who, in the estimation of his compatriots, is by no means stylish and mysteriously only passably good-looking. When he is joked by his friends about the post of honor given to this production of a photograph and questioned as to the lady, he remains honorably silent. The Princess Alexandrian Elsbeth Marie Stephanie von Westphalen-Altstadt, among her other royal qualities, knew very well whom she could trust. Well, thank you very much. What's in the box? Yes, Emily Thatcher. Thank you very much for joining us for Fireside Tales with Wolfgang number 39, which means next week is Fireside Tales with Wolfgang XXXX. This is the moonshine so alcoholic as to deserve an entirely different X of its own. Thank you all very much for joining us. I am going to leave the camera running for another just minute or so that everyone could say good nights to everyone else in the chat. And I'll see y'all for Lovecast 64 this coming Thursday at 6 o'clock. Thank you for joining us. Cheers. I love you. Good night.